So we're back with Philosophy15. The idea here is for my colleague Scott Aikin and I. Collectively, we are authors of the book Why We Argue and How We Should. The idea here is for the two of us to speak in an unscripted way about a philosophical issue or a philosophical question for no more than 15 minutes at a go. So I've got us on a timer now that's set to go off at 14 minutes. If no matter where we are in the conversation at 14, we will wrap it up and let you get on with whatever else you're doing with your life.
No philosophical dilly-dally.
Yeah. All right. So Scott and I had a piece appear in the online newspaper. It might be called The Critique. That appeared today. It's devoted to something we call the Owl of Minerva problem for democracy. We're just going to talk a little bit about what that is all about.
Right. So the Owl of Minerva flies at dusk. It's a kind of a poetical way of saying wisdom comes in hindsight. You can always figure out what the best way to have done it is, generally looking backwards. And so one of the ways that we think that this is important, at least to deliberative democracy, is that it looks like we develop our critical vocabularies, particularly the vocabularies that we have for errors, for slip-ups and things like that. We can see clearly the errors and slip-ups and how they work and why we fall for them afterwards. It requires making a lot of mistakes to be able to come to reason. And so as a consequence, the Owl of Minerva flies at dusk means that we have our understanding of ourselves generally only at the end of the day, not in the midst of it. And so exactly how that relates to deliberative democracy itself is going to be troubling.
Right. So it looks as if we think that democracy is, at least in some central way, the prospect that, or the proposal that collective self-government is best realized by means of citizens who are disposed to give and ask for reasons and exchange arguments about matters of public interest, then it looks as if democracy needs, we might think of sort of two vocabularies, two civic languages. One civic language is the first order language that allows us to formulate positions about the public good, about justice and injustice, about what direction our collective lives should take, and about the principles that our collective lives should be organized around. That's what we might call the first order language. It is the language by means of which we disagree about sentencing policy, about taxation, about who should be dog catcher, how much money should go to the military, so on and so forth. But in a deliberative democracy, although that the activity of sharing and exchanging reasons within that first order of vocabulary is often the focus of much of the deliberative democratic theory, within deliberative democracy, there also has to be what we might call a second order or a meta language. That is, deliberative democratic citizens have to also be able to formulate ideas and proposals and criticisms and principles governing discussions about the first order language and the way it's deployed. That is, if we're in the business of arguing about the public good, we also need to afford for ourselves the vocabulary by means of which we can argue about how those arguments about the public good are best conducted. So it looks as if then we've got two tracks that are necessary for deliberative democracy. First order track, which is our vocabulary by means of which we formulate and exchange positions and arguments about first order questions about what the law should be, what the state should be doing, how our lives should be structured. And then a meta language, which is a language about how those arguments and discussions ought to be conducted. I take it that the Owl of Minerva problem confronts us when we or what the Owl of Minerva problem is the problem that the second order vocabulary, the meta language, is going to be largely diagnostic, right? It's going to be trained on the task of identifying failures of first order argumentation. The Owl of Minerva problem is the problem that's a lot of times the failures are visible as failures only in light of having already made the error. So we come to see certain, let's put it this way, we can see certain forms of rhetoric as rhetoric as opposed to just good argumentation only in light of the realization that we were duped. Now, the challenge, I suppose, and this is in part what we discuss in the piece, in the critique, the challenge is that of devising a second-order language about democratic discourse that is neither, one, too unwieldy to be mastered by democratic citizens, and two, we need a language that is not so easily collapsible.
Right, that's the problem.
Collapsible into just more first order banter.
Right. So the crucial thing is that because meta languages have the power that they do, right? They're supposed to have, especially the meta language of logic, it has this air of rationality that you might say.
It adjudicates.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly it. Right. You are pronouncing as to what the good arguments are, and so as a consequence, there's a very strong temptation to use that meta language in your first order arguments, to be able to use that language to be able to say, oh no, that was a fallacy, and so as a consequence, we developed the meta language of fallacies and so on, looking backwards at the fallacies. That's the first version of the Owl of Minerva problem. Here's the second version. On the one hand, it's supposed to be a purely diagnostic tool. But the second problem is that once you start deploying the diagnostic tool, it itself starts being used in the first order language. So examples of this are happen all over the place, where people accuse each other in the midst of arguments. That's an ad hominem. Now, on the one hand, that's raising up out of the meta language and saying that's bad. That's a bad argument. We're not going to do that. But the problem is that if you have people who treat that as just another argument, as just another, and they get deployed just as not just we're going to start adjudicating, and I realize that you're trying to argue as best you can, and that argument didn't quite work out because that's an ad hominem, and those suffer from relevance problems. This one is the case where the meta language is supposed to be purely diagnostic, stand above and describe the norms of the practice. The problem is that the practitioners themselves are aware of that meta language and use it themselves to their advantage.
Right. So we can find, especially within the debates leading up to the Republican nomination, we can find deployment. Ted Cruz attacking Donald Trump's position on the basis of the charge that Donald Trump employs ad hominem arguments, right? It's almost, so the ad hominem is, standard ad hominem is the tactic of saying, look at how vicious this, look at this guy, he's such a jerk, so what he's saying must be false. The Owl of Minerva version, we might call it, of the ad hominem is, look at how prone he is to ad hominems. Therefore, what he says is wrong. Now, once you see that, I mean, just note, right? Two philosophy professors, you think a lot about these things, have a hard time
just getting it out,
getting the thought articulated. Yeah. And so you wonder, like, well, can we really expect this kind of second order evaluation of, it might even be higher than second order, right? It's a third order evaluation of a meta language and a first order language. Is this something that we should build into our conception of good democratic citizenship? It's hard for professional philosophers to sort of get a pithy articulation of the problem.
Yeah.
Yet, all of the creativity that we have with language, that language is this sort of seemingly infinitely creative, dynamic tool, creates the problem that our meta language, the diagnostic language we employ to blame and praise argumentative performances at the first level, is always going to lag behind the first order deployments. And so we don't even yet have the right concepts. I mean, we just started the Owl of Minerva version of the ad hominem. It's like we need another set of concepts to talk about the case where I charge another person with being a deployer of the ad hominem as a way of discrediting what he says.
So one of our previous episodes had the argument that we have to think about argumentation not only as products, premises and conclusion, but also as processes, dialectical conception of argument. And this is another case where we see the dialectical conception of argument and places where even the way that we conceive of how an argument is dialectical, having an effect on the way that people argue, right? So the Owl of Minerva problem in these kinds of cases is so particular just to the way that argumentation works, that you might say the way that we theorize argument, it turns out, changes argument, right? Because we had a theory about fallacies, it changed the way that people argue. Why? Because the people who are arguing are interested in the language of logic. Why? Because that's what they should be doing. Right? So there are two consequences. One is that theory is always going to lag behind the practice. Right? Now that's good news, bad news, right? The bad news is that theory is never going to be able to fix all the problems beforehand. That's the bad news. The good news is that there's always going to be logic to be done. There's always philosophy, right? We're always going to have a job to do.
I'm not sure if that's good news or bad news, but with that, this has been Philosophy15 with Scott Aikin and Robert Talisse. Thanks for checking it out, and we'll pick up on another topic, maybe related to this one, next time.
All right.